What piece placement supports pawn breaks? Have you ever wondered how the placement of your pieces can make or break your pawn strategy in chess? Let's dive into the details of what piece placement truly supports pawn breaks. Successful pawn breaks are not just about the pawns themselves. They relying heavily on how your pieces are positioned to support these advances. First, think about controlling key squares and files. Your pieces should be placed to dominate the squares where the pawn break will happen. For instance, rooks and queens should ideally be on open or semi-open files that the pawn break aims to create. Knights and bishops need to control critical squares around the pawn breakpoint. This way, they can either support the pawn push or exploit weaknesses created in your opponent's position. Next, consider the support behind the pawn you want to advance. The pawn that is about to break through enemy lines needs backing from other pieces or pawns. This support is essential to prevent the pawn from being easily captured. For example, a knight or bishop positioned behind or next to the pawn can protect it and cover important squares. Space advantage plays a significant role as well. When you have more space, your pieces can move freely, making your pawn break more effective. If your pieces are actively placed, controlling central and key squares, you can initiate a pawn break with greater confidence. This allows your pieces to quickly occupy the newly opened lines or weakened squares created by the break. Coordination among your pieces is also vital. After a pawn break opens files or diagonals, your heavy pieces, like rooks and queens, should be ready to take over these lines. Bishops and knights should be positioned to take advantage of any newly weakened squares or outposts created by the pawn break. This coordinated piece placement turns a simple pawn push into a tactical opportunity. Sometimes, a pawn break may involve sacrificing a pawn to gain the initiative. In such cases, your pieces must be placed so they can quickly capitalize on your opponent's forced responses. For example, placing a knight or bishop ready to jump into weakened squares after the break can justify a pawn sacrifice. Let's look at some examples of piece placement that supports common pawn breaks. In the Queen's Gambit, the d4 to d5 break is often supported by the c1 bishop and knights, while rooks prepare to occupy the c and d files. In the King's Indian Attack, the f4 to f5 break sees the knight and bishop supporting the f-pawn, while the queen and rook prepare to pressure the king side. On the queen side, a c4 to c5 break is supported by the knight on d2 or b3 and the bishop on g2 or b2, with rooks ready on the c and d files. In summary, the placement of your pieces is vital for supporting pawn breaks. Control key squares, provide support behind the advancing pawn, maximize piece activity, and prepare to exploit the changes that follow. With the right piece placement, a pawn break can become a powerful strategic and tactical weapon in your chess game.